I'm Sam Weeks. I'm a fourth-year medical student, and I'm currently applying for a general surgery residency coming this December. And in this video, we're going to go over how I crushed Step 2 CK, things that worked for me, and see if I can help you. Disclaimer, this is going to be what I did, what worked for me, and also talk about some things that I would do differently. This is not a guarantee to work for you, but I think a lot of these tips could be applied to anyone studying for Step 2 CK this year. And I should go in before going over everything else a little bit about myself. So I'm naturally not a good test taker. I struggled on the MCAT. I got, I think, a pretty average score, 505, high enough to get me into medical school, but I wouldn't say it was a superb score. Standardized tests have always been something I've struggled with in the past. And so doing well on Step 2 CK was something very important to me, and so it took a lot of preparation, a lot of time. And I say this not to discourage you, but to show that someone who may not be a very good test taker like myself can still succeed on Step 2 CK. So here's the outline for today's video. I'm going to try and keep it short and sweet. We'll go over first what score I got, second, what I did to get that score, and lastly, what things I would do differently or change from what I did. So I took both Step 2 CK and Level 2. On Step 2 CK, I got a 257, and on Level 2, I got a 599. So what I did to get my 257 really comes down to three things. But before we go into those three things, it's important to understand that you need to set a base, and that's really in preparing for Step 1. And for me, as you prepare well for Step 1, doing all those resources of Sketchy, Pathoma, your practice questions, and everything else, that really helps set the foundation. A good Step 1 preparation will really set you up for success for Step 2 CK. Now, having said that, the three things I did to do well on Step 2 CK after having done all those other things was Anki, practice questions, and then divine intervention podcasts. And the way that worked for me, it really begins when you're doing your clerkships third year. So if I was on a surgery rotation, I would try and do all of the Anki Step 2 specific no dupes flashcards in the Anki deck prior to that rotation. So what that would consist of is the rotation prior, I'd try and do 25 to 50 flashcards a day to try and get through the upcoming rotation's flashcards. So then when I entered that rotation, I could then start my practice questions. And I used Amboss during my clerkships, and then I used UWorld after. And I would highly recommend completing 2 Q banks before you hit your dedicated period. Or if it's part of your dedicated period, 2 Q banks before you do your NBMEs. And then Divine Intervention Podcast was a way for me to fill in gaps, to have some passive learning when I was doing a run or driving in the car or commuting, or to really fill in those gaps. And so the way I would recommend a student go about this, their third year in preparation for Step 2 CK, is I'd say get up early and do your questions first thing. Because at the end of the day, after you've done your whole day of clinic, you're not going to want to come home and do 25, 30 or more questions. So I'd say get up early, whatever allotment of questions you need to finish that Q bank for that subject. So if I'm in a surgery rotation, to finish all of the surgery questions in my Q bank before I take my shelf exam. And so if you can do your questions in the morning, then during your clinic day, if you have downtime or you get off early, that's when I would do my flashcards and try and get ahead on that. And then the one thing I would add that I thought was valuable, not just during clinic or clerkships, was making flashcards on questions that I missed. And that you can take all the way to dedicated until you take your exam. Because I was focusing on just Step 2 no dupes flashcards, you might say there might be some stuff from Step 1 that I'm missing. Well, because I'm doing a lot of practice questions, and then anytime I miss a question, I make a flashcard on it that really fills in those gaps. And then use Divine Intervention Podcasts just to fill in those gaps, learn a little extra. And I gotta say, because he's always revamping his material, I think it's very helpful and it helps you really get some understanding, because sometimes with Anki you're doing a lot of memorizing, and Divine Intervention Podcast helps you get some of that understanding. And as far as the practice questions go, what worked for me is, so during clerkships I mostly did Amboss, and then when I finished Amboss, kind of crossing over December into the spring part of clerkships, I started incorporating UWorld, and I tried to finish all of UWorld before I began my quote-unquote dedicated study, which was mostly doing NBMEs. I really thought that helped me. It helped me get a strong foundation. And most of all, it helped me practice taking a test, because a second part of Step 2 CK is having endurance and being able to sit through multiple blocks of questions. And so when I did AMBOSS, it was mostly in tutor mode, untimed, which could really help you focus on the understanding. When I did UWorld, it was mostly timed, non-tutor mode, test-taking mode, to really emphasize my test-taking ability. And so after having done that, after I finished UWorld, I was then able to start my NBMEs and really hound in and taking practice tests and going through those CMS forms. And I thought for me that really helped me be successful. So what things would I change from what I did? Well, first off, I think I would have done CMS forms earlier. So CMS forms are almost like mini shelf exams for each subject. And what I did is after I finished UWorld, I would go through CMS forms and then take about 2 practice exams, full-length NBMEs each week, up until my test date for a number of weeks. But I'd wish I'd done some of those CMS forms earlier during my shelf rotation. So if I had to do it again, I would have done my AMBOSS or UWorld QBank going through, and then as I approach my test it, I would have done those CMS forms then. I sometimes felt like I was unable to finish my AMBOSS or UWorld QBank during that rotation, so I was trying to finish that rather than prioritizing a CMS form. And I feel like it would have been okay to have not finished the bank entirely and been able to do it on the back end, and having done those CMS forms earlier, because ultimately I was unable to finish all the CMS forms before I took my exam. I did most of them, but there were still some I was unable to get through before my exam, and I thought that would have been helpful. Things that I thought went really well is making flashcards on stuff I missed, as well as doing all the NBMEs, all 10 of them, doing the AMBOSS practice questions and UWorld practice questions, in addition to the 2 UWorld full-length assessments and AMBOSS self-assessment. Now, something to keep in mind so that you don't feel totally discouraged. When I was going through it, and I'm sure it's different for everyone, but it's a really tough time. You're going through a lot of questions. Sometimes you're seeing progress and you're improving, other times you're not. And so you can feel discouraged if you're not scoring where you want to be scoring. And I'd say stick with it, keep being diligent, take breaks when you need them, because it's better to come in fresh, sharpen your axe, sort of say. But don't feel discouraged if you're not totally scoring where you want to be, at least within a relative margin. And I say that because, in fact, my test day score of 257 ended up being my best practice test, or best score compared to my practice tests. Because my best one prior, I can't remember which NBME it was, but I was in the 250s, low 250s for most of my later NBMEs, yet I didn't ever get 257 until my actual test day. So just keep that in mind, that you might be surprised on test day, but at the same time, I wouldn't discount not taking it seriously, because it's important to build that foundation in content knowledge by going through all those questions, listening to Divine Intervention podcast or some other resource to really cover material, and then having flashcards to fill in those gaps on the questions you miss. But then it's also important to build endurance. I think on my good days, when I was in dedicated, I was doing 200 to 240 questions a day. And so it takes some time to build up to that, but I think by really improving your schedule to be as efficient as possible, it'll really help you succeed. So in conclusion, if I can do it, you can do it. I wasn't a great test taker, but I think anyone, if they put in the time, start preparing early and being diligent all of third year, and by doing that, it'll make your dedicated a lot better. You're always going to get less done in dedicated than you think you will, but then planning enough time so that you can really succeed on your exam. And also, I would add to keep in mind what you need to be competitive for whatever specialty you're applying for. So for me, applying for general surgery, I think the mean score of those who were accepted into general surgery last year was around 250. So getting 257 puts me above that average. So that gives me a good chance into matching. And so keep in mind whatever it is for your score so you can set your goal. Because I wouldn't recommend the same thing for everyone. Maybe someone needs to do a little bit more to get into their specialty of choice, but maybe someone can get away with a little bit less. And so I just say that I'm not a great test taker, but I could still succeed in reaching my goals, and so can you. Thank you.